The first time Audrey walked into my office, she was carrying a rolled-up set of drawings under one arm and a coffee in the other hand, and she didn't knock. "My name is Colin Mercer. I'm a structural engineer at a mid-sized firm in Calgary. The kind of place where half the staff has been there for 15 years and the other half is trying to figure out if they want to stay that long. I'd been there for 9 years at that point. I had my own office, a window that faced the parking garage, and a reputation for being the person you came to when something wasn't adding up on paper." Audrey was the new senior architect from the Edmonton office. They'd transferred her down in January to lead a mixed-use development we were doing near East Village. I knew her name before I met her because our project lead, a guy named Frank, had said, "She's sharp, doesn't waste time, and she'll push back if she thinks you're wrong." In my experience, that's either the best kind of colleague or the most exhausting one. Sometimes both. She unrolled the drawings on the empty half of my desk without asking, smoothed them flat with her palm, and pointed to a section near the northeast corner of the building. "The mechanical room on level 3, she said. "I've got a rooftop unit sitting above it. HVAC is telling me the total load is around 12,000 pounds. Does the slab work?" I looked at the drawings. I looked at my own notes from the week before. I said, "Probably not as shown. I'll need to run the numbers." She nodded. I figured. "Just tell me what you need from me." That was it. That was the whole first conversation. She rolled up the drawings, tucked them back under her arm, picked up her coffee and left. I thought about that moment a lot later, not because it was significant at the time. It wasn't. I thought about it because of how completely ordinary it was, and how nothing about it suggested that, a year and a half later, I would be standing in my own kitchen at 11 o'clock on a Thursday night, wondering how I had managed to almost let the whole thing slip past me. We worked closely on that East Village project for about 4 months. Audrey was exactly what Frank had described. She was precise, she was fast, and she absolutely pushed back. There was a moment in February where I told her a transfer beam she wanted to eliminate was actually load-bearing, and she looked at me for a long second and said, "Walk me through it." Not defensively, just, "Show me the work." So I did, and when I was done she said, "Okay, you're right. I hate it, but you're right," and we moved on. I respected that more than I can explain. I've worked with people who would have argued for another hour just to save face. By March we had a running joke about the coffee machine on our floor. It was one of those pod machines that the office had bought during some wellness initiative, and it made coffee that tasted like hot water with ambition. Every morning Audrey would come in with a cup from the place down the street, and every morning I'd be standing at the office machine doing my best with what we had. She offered to grab me one a couple of times. I always said no. I don't know why. Habit maybe. I've never been good at letting people do small things for me. We fell into a kind of rhythm. She'd stop by my office 2 or 3 times a week to talk through something. Sometimes it was structural. Sometimes it was just whatever was going on with the project. She was funny in a dry way that took a while to pick up on. She'd say something completely deadpan and then wait, and if you caught it, she'd give this small smile that meant you'd passed some kind of test you didn't know you were taking. I noticed I started cleaning up the second chair in my office, the one I usually left covered in drawings. I noticed I started actually going to get a better coffee from down the street. I didn't connect any of it at the time. I'm apparently not great at connecting things about myself in real time. The East Village project wrapped in April. Different phases, different teams, and Audrey moved on to a project on the other side of the building with a different structural lead. We still saw each other in the hallway, still exchanged emails occasionally when something crossed over, but the 2 or 3 times a week became once a week and then maybe once every 2 weeks. I noticed. I told myself I didn't. It was Frank who first said something, and I wish he hadn't, because once it was said out loud it became a thing I couldn't put back. We were walking to the parking lot one afternoon in May and he said, completely without preamble, "You know, Audrey asked about you the other day." I said, "About what?" She asked if you were working on anything interesting right now. He paused. "She didn't ask about the project. She asked about you." I didn't say anything to that. Frank is not a subtle person. He looked at me the way you look at someone who has just walked into a glass door and is trying to pretend it didn't happen. Then he unlocked his truck and got in it and left me standing there. In June, we ended up on the same interdepartmental committee for a new sustainable design initiative the company was rolling out. 4 people from architecture, 4 from structural, some people from mechanical and electrical. We met every second Thursday for 2 hours in the big boardroom on the 6th floor. The first meeting, Audrey sat across the table from me. I spent most of it looking at my notes. The second meeting, she sat one seat down from me, and when someone said something particularly circular about embodied carbon targets, she turned to me with that small smile and said, very quietly, "We're going to be here a while." We started walking back down to our floor together after those meetings. It was practical. Same floor, same elevator. But the walks started lasting longer than they needed to. We'd end up standing in the hallway near the elevators talking for another 10 or 15 minutes about nothing in particular. The project. The city. A restaurant she'd tried near her place in Inglewood. A trail I'd done out near Bragg Creek on the weekend. One Thursday in late July she asked me, "Do you actually like this city or did you just up here?" I thought about it. "Both," I said. "I ended up here and then I liked it." She nodded slowly. "Same." Then she said, "I keep finding new things about it. Like it keeps offering more than I expected." I thought she meant the city. I think, looking back, she might not have only meant the city. I went home that night and sat on my couch for a while without turning the TV on. In August, some of us from the office went out after work on a Friday. Not a planned thing. One of the junior engineers, a guy named Brett, had just finished his Eng exam and someone said we should go get a drink. There were maybe 8 of us, and we ended up at a bar a few blocks from the office. Audrey came. She sat at the end of the table and for the first half hour she was in a conversation with a woman from Mechanical named Sandra, and I talked to Frank and Brett. At some point the group shuffled around the way groups do, and Audrey ended up next to me. We talked for 2 hours. I don't remember exactly what we talked about. I remember she grew up in a small town north of Edmonton and left at 18 and never really looked back. I remember she had done a semester abroad in Portugal and said it had changed the way she understood light. I told her I'd grown up here in Calgary, which she thought was unusual. Most people in Calgary seemed to be from somewhere else. I told her the city looked different to me because of it. She said she thought that was probably an advantage. At some point she said, "You're not what I expected when I first came to this office." I asked what she'd expected. She thought about it and said, "I'm not sure. Something more closed off, I think." I said, "I'm pretty closed off." She said, "I know. But not in the way I thought." I still don't entirely know what she meant by that, but I thought about it for the rest of the weekend. September. The Sustainable Design Committee was getting towards its final report. We were spending more time on it than any of us had budgeted for. Audrey and I had started just texting each other sometimes, work things, mostly, but not always. She sent me a photo one Saturday of a building she'd walked past in Kensington. An old brick thing with a new glass addition that shouldn't have worked but did. The text just said, "What do you think?" I looked at it for a while. Then I wrote back, "The transition is doing a lot of work, but it earns it." She sent back, "Exactly." That was the whole conversation. I put my phone down and felt something that I had no idea what to do with. The thing is, and I want to be clear about this because I've thought about it a lot, I wasn't avoiding anything consciously. I wasn't telling myself no. I wasn't making a decision. I was just moving through my days, and she was in them, and I wasn't doing anything about it, because I hadn't fully admitted to myself that there was something to do anything about. I'm an engineer. I'm trained to identify loads and stresses and failure points. I can look at a connection detail and know immediately what it will and won't hold. Apparently I am completely useless at applying any of that to myself. October. We finished the committee report. On the last meeting day, we went around the table doing final comments, and when it got to Audrey, she said the process had been more valuable than she'd expected, and she looked briefly at me when she said it. Afterwards, walking to the elevator, she said, "So that's done?" I said, "Yeah." She said, "I'm going to miss the Thursday walks." I said, "We could still walk sometimes." She looked at me just for a second, and then she said, "Colin, you have to actually ask." The elevator came. She got in. I stood there for a moment and then got in after her. We rode down to our floor in silence, and I was completely incapable of forming a sentence. She said, "See you later," at her office door, and I said yeah and went to my desk and sat there feeling like someone had just shown me a structural calculation I should have done months ago. I didn't ask. Not that week. Not the week after. I've thought a lot about why. Part of it was the office thing. She was a colleague, and I'd always been careful about that. Part of it was that I genuinely wasn't sure I was reading it right, even after she'd essentially told me directly. And part of it, the part I'm least proud of, was that things were fine as they were, and fine is comfortable. and I am apparently very good at choosing comfortable over what I actually wanted. Frank noticed. He always notices things he shouldn't. He came to my office one morning in November and sat down and said, "Without any preamble whatsoever, you're going to regret it." I said, "I don't know what you're talking about." He said, "Yes, you do. And so does she." "That's the problem." He stood up. "People like her don't wait around forever, Colin. She's not needy. She's patient. Those are different things." He left. I stared at the parking garage outside my window for a while. He was right. I knew he was right. Audrey had a full life. She had friends. She went on weekend trips. She was the kind of person who would be fine no matter what. That wasn't the question. The question was whether I was going to keep sitting on the right side of the answer and call it prudence. November was cold, Calgary cold, which is specific and real, and gets into everything. I ran into Audrey in the coffee room on a Tuesday, and she asked how I was doing, and I said fine, and she said still fine. And it was the most direct anything had ever felt in my life. And I said yes, because I am, apparently, a structural engineer in a winter city, with the emotional awareness of a parking garage. She smiled. Not the small test-passing smile. Something quieter. She said, "Okay, Colin," and went back to her desk. I stood there alone in the coffee room for a minute. The pod machine hummed. I thought about Frank's words. I thought about October and the elevator. I thought about a photograph of a brick building in Kensington, and a text conversation that was just 2 sentences long, and had somehow meant more to me than most conversations I'd had that year. My roommate at the time, I had a roommate until that past September, a guy from work named Darren who'd moved out when his partner bought a place, had told me, before he left, that I was the most patient person he'd ever met and also the most oblivious. He'd meant it affectionately. I was starting to think he'd been more right than affectionate. I got myself a coffee from the machine. It tasted exactly like it always did. I went back to my desk and looked at my calendar and thought, Thursday. I knew she had a site visit Thursday morning and she'd be back by noon. I knew because she'd mentioned it offhandedly the week before. I don't know what I was planning, exactly. I just knew that fine was not where I wanted to be anymore. On Thursday, I had lunch at my desk like I usually do, and at 1:15 I got up and walked down the hall to her office and knocked on the door frame. She was at her desk with drawings spread out in front of her, back from the site visit, hair still a little windswept from outside. She looked up. I said, "Do you want to get dinner sometime?" She held my gaze for a second, then she said, "I was starting to think you were never going to say that." I said, "I know. I'm sorry it took this long." She said, "Saturday?" I said, "Saturday." She went back to her drawings. I went back to my office. I sat down and realized my hands were slightly unsteady and that I had been scared. Just scared. That's the only word for it. Not of rejection exactly. Of what came after, yes. Of something real. We went to a place she knew in the Beltline, a small restaurant that had been there for 20-something years and didn't have a social media presence and was full on a Saturday night anyway. We talked for 3 hours. We closed out the table. She ordered a glass of Cab Franc and I had the same, and she raised an eyebrow, because she'd never seen me make a spontaneous decision about anything, I think. We talked about the things you talk about when you already know the professional version of a person, and you're building the other version. Where she lived growing up, Barhead, an hour north of Edmonton, flat and cold, and she'd loved it and hated it simultaneously. Her mother, who still lived there and called on Sundays. Her theory about why Edmonton and Calgary people have a specific kind of chip on their shoulder about Toronto that's actually about something else entirely. My theory about why I'd stayed in Calgary when most of my engineering class had scattered. She said she thought people who stayed in the city they grew up in were either deeply rooted or deeply stuck, and the only way to tell the difference was what they did with it. I said, "Which one am I?" She looked at me across the table. "I think you're still figuring that out, but you're moving in the right direction." On the sidewalk outside, she put her hands in her coat pockets against the November air and said, "Thank you for dinner." I said, "Thank you for being patient with me." She said, "I wasn't patient. I was just interested." "There's a difference," I said. "Is there?" She said, "Yes. Patient implies it was a burden. It wasn't." I walked her to her car. She drove a dark blue Subaru, Alberta plates, a small dent on the rear bumper she'd gotten in a parkade on a trip to Vancouver and hadn't bothered fixing. I stood there on the street in the cold and she looked at me and I thought, I have been bad at this for a very long time, but I do not have to be bad at it, right now. I said, "Can I see you again next week?" She smiled. That small one, the one I'd been cataloging without knowing I was doing it. "You can see me Monday at the office," she said. But yes, next week, properly, she got in her car. I stood on the sidewalk until the taillights disappeared around the corner, and then I walked back to where I'd parked, and the cold didn't bother me at all. That was 11 months ago. There are things I'd have done differently. If I could, I would have asked sooner. I would have said yes to the coffee she offered to grab me on those January mornings. I would have caught myself earlier in that elevator, in October, and said the thing that needed to be said. But there's something I've come to think about all of that. I don't know if I could have gotten to the person who finally walked down that hallway without becoming the person who spent a year not doing it. I know that sounds like the kind of thing you tell yourself to feel better about being slow. Maybe it is. But the version of me that asked on that Thursday in November had run out of excuses, and I think running out of excuses is different from never having them in the first place. Audrey would probably tell it differently. She'd probably be funnier about it. She'd probably do a very precise and loving imitation of me standing in that elevator, unable to speak, and make it sound like the most endearing thing rather than the most frustrating. That's one of the things about her. She has a way of taking the things I'm embarrassed about and making them feel survivable. She's still in the office. We were careful about it at first, kept it out of the hallways, didn't make it anyone else's business until it was clearly a thing, and then it was clearly a thing and nobody seemed particularly surprised. Frank said, "Finally," and then immediately went back to whatever he'd been doing. I got rid of the pod machine coffee. She got me started at the place down the street. I go every morning now. She meets me there on the days we come in at the same time, and we walk to the office together past the bare November trees that are, right now, just starting to hold a little snow, and the city looks different than it used to. The same streets, the same skyline, just seen from a slightly different angle, more than I expected. The way she said once, sitting across from me at a table in the Beltline. I think she might have meant it about more than the city that time too. I should have asked sooner, but I'm glad I finally asked.